The winds sweep across the rugged mountains of Greece, carrying with them the whispers of a time when civilizations clashed and destinies were decided at the edge of the spear. The story begins not at the battlefield itself, but in the tension of two worlds destined to collide, the sprawling empire of Persia, stretching from the Indus Valley to the shores of the Aegean, and the fiercely independent city-states of Greece, small in size, yet immense in spirit. Persia, under the rule of King Xerxes, inherited the vast conquests of his father, Darius. To the Persians, the world was meant to bend beneath the weight of their authority. To the Greeks, however, freedom was not a gift granted by kings, but a birthright worth defending, even against impossible odds. Between them lay the narrow pass of Thermopylae, a sliver of earth carved between sea and mountain, destined to become one of history's immortal stages. The origins of this clash reach back decades, when Persia first looked westward toward the Greek world. The Ionian Revolt, a spark of rebellion among Greek cities under Persian control, ignited a fire that drew Darius into the Aegean. His forces struck at Athens and its allies, seeking to humble them for their defiance. The confrontation reached its climax at Marathon, where the Athenians, against every expectation, repelled the Persian might. It was a stunning victory, a reminder that courage and strategy could balance the scales against overwhelming numbers. Yet victory at Marathon did not bring peace, it brought reprisal. Darius prepared for another campaign, but fate intervened. His death left the task to his son. Xerxes inherited not just an empire, but a mission: to punish the Greeks, to avenge Persian honor, and to crush this thorn of resistance that dared to question the dominion of the great king. Xerxes' preparations were staggering in scale. The ancient sources describe an army numbering in the hundreds of thousands, drawn from every corner of the empire. Persians, Medes, Babylonians, Egyptians, Indians, Scythians, all assembled under one banner. The logistics alone were unprecedented: the bridging of the Hellespont to carry armies from Asia into Europe, the carving of a canal through Mount Athos to avoid the perils of the sea. Each measure spoke of ambition bordering on the divine, for Xerxes did not march merely as a king, but as one who believed himself ordained to rule the known world. The Greeks, fractured as they often were, could only look upon this force with awe and dread, yet they did not yield. Amid the city-states, one stood apart: Sparta, a society forged in discipline and war. Unlike Athens, with its democracy and naval power, Sparta was landbound, rigid, and martial. Every Spartan boy was trained from childhood in the agoge, stripped of comfort, hardened through hardship, and bound by oath to serve the state as a warrior. Their entire culture was dedicated to the art of fighting and the preservation of their way of life. To them, honor was measured in obedience to law and in sacrifice for the greater whole. It was this ethos that would soon define their role in the coming storm. The Hellenic League, an uneasy alliance of Greek city-states, convened to decide how they might resist the Persian tide. Geography offered them an opportunity: the pass at Thermopylae, narrow enough that a small force could hold back a multitude. It was here that the Spartans, under their king Leonidas, would take their stand. Leonidas was no mere ruler, but a warrior king, schooled in the Spartan way, respected among allies and feared by enemies. When the council resolved that Sparta would send aid, Leonidas chose his men not from the strongest or the most reckless, but from those who had living sons to carry on their names. In this choice lay a somber acknowledgement: this was not a march to victory, but to death.
The journey to Thermopylae was marked by urgency and solemnity. Leonidas led 300 Spartans, accompanied by allies from other cities, Thespians, Thebans, and more, altogether numbering a few thousand. Though small against the Persian host, they carried with them a resolve unmeasured by numbers. Their march was not only a military maneuver, but a statement that Greece would resist, that freedom would not be surrendered without blood. The men understood the gravity of their mission. They joked as soldiers do, lightening the burden of fate, but beneath the words was the steel of conviction. They knew they were marching into legend. Thermopylae itself was a place chosen by nature for defiance. The pass ran between steep mountains and the waters of the Malian Gulf, at points narrowing so tightly that only a handful of men could stand abreast. Here, the Persians' numbers would be blunted, their advantage diminished. The Greeks fortified their position, repairing an ancient wall that spanned the narrowest point. Behind it, they prepared to meet the tide. Scouts reported the immensity of the enemy force, its banners stretching beyond sight, its campfires lighting the horizon like constellations on the earth. To many, such a sight might have broken the will. To the Spartans, it was confirmation of their purpose. As Xerxes' forces approached, the great king himself expected the Greeks to scatter. To his mind, no rational men could oppose such a host. Yet when he offered terms of surrender, Leonidas answered not with submission, but with defiance. The famous command came when Xerxes demanded that the Greeks lay down their arms. Leonidas replied with words that echoed through centuries. Molon lab. Come and take them. It was not bravado, but a distillation of the Spartan creed, an unshakable refusal to yield even in the face of annihilation. Xerxes, astonished, prepared his men for battle. The first clash came as wave after wave of Persian soldiers surged into the pass. Lightly armed, they were ill-suited to the confined space, where the Spartans' heavy shields and long spears created an impenetrable wall. Shoulder to shoulder, disciplined and unyielding, the Greeks held the line. Each advance was met with a counter, each cry of the enemy answered by the iron rhythm of the phalanx. Hours passed, bodies fell, yet the line did not break. Persian arrows darkened the sky, but the Greeks fought in the shadow without faltering. Xerxes watched from his throne, disbelieving, as his vast numbers failed to overwhelm so few. What unfolded at Thermopylae was more than a battle of arms. It was a contest of wills. The Spartans exemplified the discipline of men who had trained their entire lives for this moment, and their allies matched their valor. For 2 days the pass held, the Persian advance stalled by courage and terrain. It was as if the tide of empire had struck against an immovable rock. The stories tell of Spartans combing their hair before combat, a ritual of calm before the storm, unnerving to foes who could not understand how men so outnumbered could face death with serenity. Yet such was the measure of their resolve, that honor mattered more than life, that freedom was worth any price. The second dawn at Thermopylae broke with the cries of trumpets echoing through the mist, the air heavy with the stench of sweat, blood, and salt spray from the Gulf. The Persians, enraged at their failure to shatter the defenders on the first day, prepared for renewed assault. Xerxes, humiliated by the resilience of so few, resolved to throw more of his vast army into the furnace of the pass. He unleashed the immortals, his elite guard, 10,000 strong, disciplined and feared throughout the empire. If any force could break the Greeks, it would be them. Clad in ornate armor and armed with short spears and wicker shields, they advanced with confidence born of reputation. Yet reputation meant little in the confined throat of Thermopylae. The immortals found themselves pressed against the immovable wall of bronze and discipline. Their lighter shields shattered against the heavy hoplons of the Spartans. Their shorter spears snapped against the reach of the Greek doru. Wave after wave the immortals charged, only to be driven back, their ranks collapsing upon themselves in the chaos of the narrow pass. The fighting was merciless and intimate, shields locked, spears thrusting, swords flashing when shafts broke in the press. The clang of metal against metal mingled with the screams of the wounded, the roar of men straining against the weight of fate. To fight in the phalanx was to surrender individuality, to move as a single organism, each man's shield guarding his neighbor, each thrust of the spear part of a greater rhythm. The Spartans and their allies embodied this unity, and in that unity lay their strength. Xerxes' chosen guard, men who had cowed nations, found themselves bleeding upon the stones, their bodies heaped where the Greeks refused to yield. The second day wore on, the heat of the sun baking armor and drying blood into crust upon the skin. Still the line held. Each time the Persians surged, they were thrown back with staggering losses. Xerxes watched in mounting fury as his might was squandered upon this narrow gate of Greece. It seemed unthinkable that the empire, whose shadow stretched across continents, should be checked by so few. Yet history often turns upon the unlikely, and here, at Thermopylae, it turned with stubborn defiance. The Greeks had chosen their ground well, and the gods, it seemed, favored their courage. But courage alone could not alter the treachery of men. Among the locals lived a man named Ephialtes, whose name would become synonymous with betrayal. Driven by greed or resentment, he approached the Persians with a secret that would undo the defenders' advantage. High in the mountains lay a hidden path, a goat track winding over the ridges and descending behind the Greek position. It was no broad road for armies, but a trail known to shepherds, treacherous and narrow yet passable. If Xerxes could send troops through this path, the defenders of Thermopylae would be encircled, their wall of shields rendered useless by attack from the rear. To the great king, it was the answer he had sought. To history, it was the moment when fate began to close around Leonidas and his men. That night, under cover of darkness, Xerxes dispatched the immortals once more, this time not into the pass but up the hidden path. They marched in silence, led by Ephialtes, their armor glinting faintly in the starlight as they wound through the pines and stones. The Greeks had stationed Phocian troops to guard the trail, but when the immortals approached, the defenders, overwhelmed by arrows and outnumbered, withdrew into the heights, leaving the path open. By dawn, the Persians stood poised to descend upon the rear of the Greek position. Leonidas learned of the betrayal as the sun rose. Scouts brought word that the enemy was moving behind them, and the truth of their situation became clear. To remain was to face encirclement, annihilation certain. The allied contingents debated retreat, and many were dismissed to preserve their strength for battles yet to come. Leonidas, however, chose a different path. Bound by law, by honor, and by destiny, he resolved to remain with his Spartans. They had not come to Thermopylae to survive, but to stand, to embody resistance, to buy with their blood the time Greece needed to marshal its defense. With them, a band of Thespians refused to leave, choosing to share in the fate of the Spartans, though they lacked the same compulsion. Their courage was no less great, for they stayed not by law, but by choice. Some Thebans, too, remained, though their loyalty was uncertain. Together, this remnant prepared for the final act.
The last day at Thermopylae dawned like a drumbeat of inevitability. Leonidas gathered his men, and the words spoken were not of despair but of purpose. He knew they would fall, yet he also knew that their fall would echo louder than any surrender. They sharpened their weapons, repaired their armor, and combed their hair as Spartan warriors did before death. Such calm rituals unnerved their foes, who could not fathom how men so doomed could face their end with serenity. To the Spartans, it was not madness but clarity. They would meet death on their own terms, unbroken and unbowed. When the Persians advanced, the Greeks no longer fought defensively. They surged out from behind their wall, striking with ferocity, driving the enemy back once more. They fought with reckless abandon, no longer guarding their lives but seeking only to inflict maximum cost upon their foes. The Persians reeled under the assault, and for a time the pass seemed to blaze with Greek fury. But numbers and encirclement cannot be denied forever. Soon the immortals descended from the heights, closing the trap. The Greeks were surrounded, their path of retreat cut off. Still they fought, pressing into the widest part of the pass to maximize their killing before the end. Leonidas himself fell in the crush, pierced by Persian weapons, his body becoming a rallying point for his men. 3 times they drove the Persians back from his corpse, unwilling to surrender him, until at last they were overwhelmed. Around him the Spartans fought to the last. Their spears shattered, their swords dulled, their shields battered into splinters. They fought with hands, with teeth, with desperation transmuted into defiance. When the final man fell, the pass was heaped with the bodies of both Greek and Persian, the stones drinking deeply of their blood. The battle was lost, but the story was not. Xerxes surveyed the carnage, his victory Pyrrhic. For though the Spartans were dead, their stand had achieved its purpose. Word of their defiance spread across Greece, kindling resolve in hearts that might otherwise have faltered. The Persians had won Thermopylae, yet the cost was measured not in numbers but in morale. No longer could the Greeks doubt that resistance was possible, that courage could defy empire. The 300 Spartans and their allies had bought time, and time would prove more valuable than life. Their sacrifice was immortalized not only in story, but in stone. At Thermopylae, an epitaph was carved. "Go tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here obedient to their laws we lie. Simple words, yet within them a testament to the Spartan creed: obedience, duty, and sacrifice. It was not a monument to victory, but to defiance, to the belief that some things are worth more than survival. In that belief lay the seed of freedom, watered by blood, destined to grow into legend. The smoke of Thermopylae lingered long after the last spear had splintered, curling over the pass, as if the land itself sought to remember the sacrifice made there. Xerxes had his victory, but it was a hollow triumph, marked by the staggering losses his forces had endured against a fraction of their size. The death of Leonidas and his 300 Spartans, alongside the Thespians and others who chose to remain, resounded not as defeat but as defiance. Word spread across Greece like wildfire carried on the winds, and with each retelling the courage of the defenders grew larger than life. What Xerxes intended as a demonstration of Persian inevitability became instead a rallying cry for resistance. To the Greeks, the stand at Thermopylae was proof that even the mightiest empire could bleed. Yet for all its symbolic weight, the fall of Thermopylae carried grim consequences. With the pass open, Xerxes' armies poured into central Greece, their numbers swelling like a flood breaking through a dam. Thebes, having shown divided loyalty, now bowed to Persian power, while cities along the path either surrendered or were crushed. The road to Athens lay open, and the Athenians faced an impossible choice. Their city was indefensible against such a force. To remain was to invite destruction. Guided by the wisdom of Themistocles, they turned to the sea. The Athenian fleet, strengthened by recent investment in triremes, sleek, deadly warships powered by rows of oarsmen, became the heart of their strategy. Themistocles argued that salvation lay not in stone walls, but in wooden ones, a vision both practical and prophetic. The city's population was evacuated to Salamis and Troezen, leaving Athens itself to the mercy of the invaders. When Xerxes entered Athens, he found it abandoned save for a few holdouts who barricaded themselves on the Acropolis. The Persians stormed the heights, torching the temples and toppling the shrines, their flames licking the sky as the city burned. To Xerxes, it was vindication, proof that Greek defiance could be reduced to ash. Yet beneath the smoke lay a truth he could not grasp. The spirit of Athens was not in marble or wood, but in its people, now afloat upon the sea waiting for the moment to strike back. The burning of Athens, intended as humiliation, instead deepened the resolve of those who had fled. For the Greeks, the loss of their sacred city transformed the war into something far greater than a struggle for land. It became a fight for the survival of their culture, their gods, and their freedom. Meanwhile, the Greek alliance wavered under the pressure of invasion. Some argued to retreat deeper into the Peloponnese, abandoning central Greece and fortifying the Isthmus of Corinth. The Peloponnesians, concerned for their own survival, began to build a defensive wall across the isthmus, content to leave northern Greece to Persian conquest. Yet such a strategy risked dividing the alliance and sacrificing too much to the invader. It was Themistocles who argued with relentless conviction that the key lay in naval supremacy. Control of the seas could sever Persian supply lines, undermine the mobility of their vast army, and turn the tide of the war. He pressed the Allied commanders to meet the Persians at sea, even as many balked at the risk. The stage for the next great confrontation shifted from the mountains of Thermopylae to the Straits of Salamis. There, in narrow waters, not unlike the pass that Leonidas had held, the Greeks could nullify the Persian numerical advantage. Themistocles knew that in open seas, the larger Persian fleet would overwhelm them. But in the confined straits, their smaller, more maneuverable triremes could strike with devastating effect. Themistocles, master of both cunning and persuasion, even resorted to deception. He sent a secret message to Xerxes, feigning betrayal, claiming the Greeks were in disarray and planning to flee. If Xerxes struck quickly, he would crush them in their retreat. The great king, eager for decisive victory, took the bait, ordering his massive fleet into the bottleneck of the straits. As the Persian ships crowded into the narrows, oars churning the waters into froth, the trap was sprung. From hidden positions, the Greek fleet surged forward, their triremes slicing through the waves like knives. With 3 banks of oars propelling them, Their speed and agility proved decisive. The Greeks rammed the Persians amidships, shattering hulls, splintering decks, and capsizing vessels in the chaos of confined space. The Persian fleet, too numerous for the narrow waters, found itself trapped, ships colliding with one another, unable to maneuver, their strength turned against itself. From Xerxes' vantage point on a golden throne atop a hillside, he watched in disbelief as his navy was torn apart before his eyes. The Battle of Salamis was not merely a naval victory, but a strategic turning point. The Persian fleet, crippled, could no longer ensure safe passage or resupply for Xerxes' enormous land army. Without naval dominance, his position in Greece became precarious. The morale of his troops, already shaken by the unexpected ferocity of Greek resistance, faltered further. Xerxes, realizing the danger of being trapped far from home with a vulnerable army, resolved to withdraw the majority of his forces. He left behind a contingent under his general Mardonius to continue the fight, but the grand ambition of subjugating all of Greece had been broken. What began with the stand at Thermopylae found its echo at Salamis, a defiance that blossomed into victory. The ripple of these events cannot be measured merely in battles won or lost. The sacrifice of the 300 and their allies had purchased the time necessary for Greece to unite, however reluctantly, against the Persian threat. Their blood bought the strategy at Salamis. Their courage inspired the oarsmen who rowed until their muscles screamed. Their defiance whispered into the ears of every Greek who lifted a shield or spear in the months that followed. Though Thermopylae ended in slaughter, it was not the end of the war but the beginning of resistance on a scale that would reshape history. In the years that followed, the Greeks would meet the Persians again on the plains of Plataea, where hoplites assembled in force, no longer a remnant, but an army united. There they would drive Mardonius and his troops from Greek soil, ending the invasion once and for all. Yet even that final victory owed something to the shadow of Thermopylae, for the legend of Leonidas and his men gave Greece a story greater than themselves, a myth of courage that transcended defeat. It was not merely a battle fought, but a message delivered, that liberty demanded sacrifice, that tyranny could be resisted, that the measure of a people was not in their size, but in their spirit. The Persian wars did more than secure Greece from conquest. They set the stage for the flowering of Greek culture, the age of philosophy, drama, and democracy that would echo across millennia. Had Xerxes succeeded, the trajectory of Western civilization might have been unrecognizable. Instead, the sacrifice of the few preserved the possibility of the many. Thermopylae, Salamis, Plataea, these names became not just chapters of history but touchstones of identity, reminders of the thin line upon which freedom often balances. And so the story of the 300 Spartans does not end with their deaths. It endures because their stand was not only against an enemy of flesh and blood, but against the very notion that power alone defines destiny. They showed that resolve can blunt the sword, that sacrifice can forge unity, that legends can be born not of victory, but of defiance. Theirs is a story told not in the silence of defeat, but in the chorus of generations who remembered, who carried forward the meaning of their final stand. Thermopylae was a grave, but it was also a beacon, casting its light across time, guiding the course of history long after the last embers of battle had faded into the winds. Long after the bodies at Thermopylae had been buried beneath cairns of stone, long after the cries of men and the clash of bronze had faded into silence, the story of Leonidas and his Spartans began to take on a life of its own. For the Greeks who survived the wars, Thermopylae was not a defeat to be hidden, but a sacrifice to be celebrated. In their memory, the narrow pass became sacred ground, a place where the virtues of courage, obedience, and loyalty had been distilled into their purest form. The epitaph carved upon the stone, those haunting words asking the stranger to tell the Spartans that their sons lay obedient to their laws, was not merely an inscription, but a creed. It became a reminder that the laws of Sparta demanded no compromise, that the highest honor a citizen could achieve was to die in the service of the state. In this way, Thermopylae became less a battlefield than an altar upon which an offering had been made to the gods of freedom. The Spartans themselves, for all their iron discipline, did not seek to romanticize their loss. To them, the death of Leonidas and his men was simply the fulfillment of their duty. Yet among the other Greeks, the legend grew. The Athenians, whose wooden walls at Salamis had proven decisive, often looked upon the Spartans with suspicion, their militarism and rigid way of life alien to the spirit of democracy. But even they could not deny the power of the Spartan example. The stand at Thermopylae gave the fractured cities of Greece a shared narrative, a unifying myth, in which courage transcended political rivalry. It reminded them that in moments of existential peril, the petty disputes that so often divided them could be set aside for a greater purpose. The poets and historians of Greece were quick to seize upon the tale. Herodotus, the father of history, wrote with reverence of the battle, his words shaping how future generations would understand those days. He recounted not only the strategy and the bloodshed, but the spirit of the men who fought, their laconic wit, their unyielding defiance. When told that Persian arrows would blot out the sun, one Spartan replied that they would fight in the shade. Such remarks, preserved in ink, became immortal, a testimony to the Spartan habit of confronting fear with humor and death with indifference. The story spread not merely as fact but as symbol, a demonstration of how a small band of free men could stand against tyranny. This transformation from event to legend was crucial, for history alone is fragile, subject to the erosion of memory, but legend endures. Thermopylae became more than a pass in Greece. It became a metaphor for resistance itself. Whenever later generations faced overwhelming odds, they could look back to the hot gates and find inspiration. The battle whispered that numbers were not destiny, that the will to stand mattered as much as the strength of armies. In this way, the sacrifice of Leonidas and his men transcended the boundaries of time and place, becoming a story not merely of Spartans or Greeks, but of humanity itself. Yet as the legend grew, so too did the questions it raised. For what does it mean to sacrifice oneself so completely for law and duty? The Spartans lived in a society built upon harsh discipline, where the weak were culled and the individual subsumed into the collective. To some, this was the highest expression of civic virtue. To others, it was a chilling reminder of the costs of such devotion. Thermopylae forces us to consider whether freedom is purchased not only with blood, but also with the surrender of personal will. The Spartans were not free in the sense Athenians were. Their lives were bound by rigid codes from birth to death. Yet it was precisely this discipline that allowed them to hold the pass, to transform certain death into a beacon for all of Greece. Thus Thermopylae remains both inspiring and unsettling, a mirror in which each age sees its own reflection. The cultural memory of the battle was not confined to Greece alone. As Rome rose in power centuries later, Roman writers looked back to Thermopylae as a model of martial virtue. The Romans, who prized discipline and sacrifice for the Republic, found in the Spartans a kindred spirit. To them, the story was a lesson in how the few could shape the destiny of the many through sheer determination. Roman generals cited the example of Leonidas when exhorting their men before battle, and Roman poets wove the tale into their works as a symbol of courage that transcended nations. Thermopylae thus passed from Greece into the broader Mediterranean imagination, securing its place as one of antiquity's defining narratives. But legends evolve, and the meaning of Thermopylae shifted with the currents of history. During the Renaissance, when Europe rediscovered the texts of antiquity, the story found new life as a parable of liberty against despotism. Humanist scholars celebrated the Spartans not for their rigid militarism, but for their willingness to die for freedom. In an age struggling with questions of tyranny and self-rule, the hot gates became a symbol for all who would resist oppression. Painters captured the moment of Leonidas' last stand, their canvases ablaze with the clash of bronze and the fire of sacrifice, while poets retold the story in soaring verse. Each retelling reflected the concerns of its own era, reshaping the battle into a mirror for contemporary struggles. In modern times, Thermopylae continues to resonate, though its meaning remains contested. For some, it is the ultimate story of patriotism, of soldiers laying down their lives so that their nation might endure. For others, it serves as a cautionary tale, reminding us of the dangers of blind obedience to rigid codes. The Spartans are celebrated for their bravery, yet their society was built upon foundations we might now question: the subjugation of the helots, the exclusion of outsiders, the suppression of individuality. To celebrate their sacrifice, is to wrestle with the paradox of their world, a society that could produce such unmatched warriors, but at a moral cost. And yet, even with these contradictions, the resonance of Thermopylae endures, for at its core lies a universal theme. The courage to stand when standing seems impossible. The pass itself, still visible today, is a place where memory and landscape converge. Visitors walk the ground where the Spartans once fought, the mountains rising steeply to one side, the waters of the Gulf shimmering to the other. Though the coastline has shifted with time, the narrowness of the place remains, and one can imagine the thunder of feet, the clash of shields, the roar of men meeting destiny. The monument to Leonidas stands nearby, a statue gazing toward the pass, his spear poised, his face set in grim determination. Around it, wreaths and offerings remind us that even millennia later, the story has not lost its power. To stand at Thermopylae is to feel the weight of history pressing down, the silence heavy with the echoes of defiance. Thermopylae endures not because it was a victory, but because it was a defeat that transcended itself. It reminds us that there are moments when the act of resistance carries greater meaning than the outcome of battle. It teaches that courage is not measured by survival, but by the willingness to face certain doom for a cause greater than oneself. Whether viewed as a tale of patriotism, discipline, or tragedy, it continues to inspire. Because it speaks to something elemental in the human spirit. The refusal to yield when yielding seems inevitable. The 300 Spartans and their allies may have fallen, but their stand ensured that their story would rise eternal, carried forward on the tongues of poets, the pens of historians, and the hearts of all who value freedom. The survival of Greece in the wake of the Persian invasions did more than preserve the independence of a scattering of city-states along the Aegean. It altered the trajectory of world history. The defeat of Xerxes' ambitions ensured that Greece remained free from imperial conquest, and in the breathing space that followed, the seeds of a cultural flowering were sown. When we look back at Thermopylae, Salamis, and Plataea, we do not see only military events, but the opening act in a drama that would lead to philosophy, science, drama, and art, foundations upon which much of later civilization would build. The stand of Leonidas and his 300, and the victories that followed, were not isolated incidents of martial valor. They were the hinge upon which history turned. To understand the magnitude of this, we must imagine what might have been had Xerxes succeeded. The Persian Empire, vast and sophisticated though it was, did not nurture the same restless spirit of inquiry that characterized the Greek polis. Under Persian dominion, the institutions of democracy in Athens, the ferment of philosophical debate, the experiments in political and artistic freedom might never have taken root. Instead, the Greek world might have become another satrapy, its energies absorbed into the machinery of empire. By resisting, by enduring the ordeal of invasion and surviving it, Greece preserved its independence, and with that independence came the possibility of shaping ideas that would echo far beyond their own time. The legacy of Thermopylae is therefore bound not only to the courage of the men who fought, but also to what their sacrifice allowed. The democratic experiment of Athens, fragile and imperfect though it was, would have no chance to flourish without survival. In the decades after the Persian Wars, Athens entered its golden age under Pericles. The Parthenon rose upon the Acropolis. Theatre thrived with the works of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, and philosophy began its long journey with Socrates questioning the very foundations of life and virtue. Sparta, too, retained its independence, continuing its unique social system and playing its role as counterweight to Athenian ambition. The rivalry between these two great powers would eventually erupt into the Peloponnesian War, but even in their struggle, they carried forward the ideas and institutions preserved through resistance to Persia. Thermopylae itself became a touchstone for Greek identity. The Greeks saw themselves as free men standing against despotism, small but unyielding, independent yet capable of unity when threatened. This narrative was not always accurate. Greek politics remained rife with betrayal, selfishness, and division, but it became a myth powerful enough to shape reality. Myths matter, for they provide a people with the stories by which they understand themselves. For Greece, The myth of Thermopylae reinforced the idea that freedom was worth dying for, that even in hopeless struggle, meaning could be found. It became part of the cultural DNA, repeated in orations, celebrated in festivals, remembered whenever Greeks gathered to reflect on their past. The Persian Empire, by contrast, carried the sting of its failure. Xerxes' retreat marked the high water mark of Persian expansion into Europe. Though the empire endured for more than a century after, its aura of invincibility was diminished. The great king, who once commanded bridges over seas and canals through mountains, had been humbled by a people he regarded as insignificant. This perception of vulnerability would, in time, encourage new enemies. When Alexander the Great marched east more than a century later, he carried not only his army, but also the memory of these earlier wars. His campaign of conquest was, in part, revenge for the Persian invasions, a retribution carried out in the name of Greece. Alexander himself paid homage to the fallen at Thermopylae before setting out, linking his destiny to theirs, as if their sacrifice had paved the way for his victories. Thus, Thermopylae's legacy is woven through the grand narrative of East and West, freedom and empire, the few and the many. It is easy to simplify this into stark contrasts, Greeks as lovers of liberty, Persians as agents of tyranny. But the reality is more nuanced. The Persian Empire was not a monolith of oppression, but a sophisticated civilization with tolerance for many cultures, religions, and traditions. Yet in the Greek imagination, and in the telling of their history, Persia became the archetype of despotism, while Thermopylae symbolized the heroic struggle against it. It is through these stories that civilizations understand themselves, and so the Hot Gates took on a meaning larger than life. The resonance of this battle across time speaks to its universality. Whenever small nations have resisted greater powers, whenever individuals have stood against overwhelming odds, Thermopylae has been invoked. During the wars of independence in modern Greece, freedom fighters looked back to Leonidas as their model. In World War II, when Allied forces resisted Axis invasions in the same land, leaders and soldiers alike drew parallels to the Spartans' stand. Even in places far from Greece, Thermopylae has served as metaphor. Poets, statesmen, and revolutionaries have cited it as proof that courage matters, that resistance is noble even when doomed. In each retelling, the essence remains the same, the power of the few to inspire the many. Yet there is also danger in such legends, for they can be wielded to justify as well as to inspire. The Spartan ideal, with its emphasis on obedience and sacrifice, has been admired by societies that value militarism and conformity. The story of the 300 has been claimed by many, sometimes stripped of nuance, turned into a banner for causes far removed from its origins. To honor Thermopylae is to tread carefully, to recognize both the greatness of the sacrifice and the complexity of the society that made it. Sparta's world was built upon the backs of helots, upon the suppression of individual freedom in favor of collective discipline. Their courage is undeniable, their sacrifice unforgettable, but their way of life is not easily reconciled with modern ideals. The challenge is to honor the essence of their defiance without romanticizing the harsher truths of their existence. And so, Thermopylae endures as paradox, a defeat that became victory, a story both inspiring and troubling, a moment in history that shaped all that followed. To walk its ground is to feel the weight of time pressing in, to imagine the clash of spears and the cries of men echoing between mountain and sea. But more than that, it is to stand at a crossroads where history and myth intersect, where the actions of a few forged meaning for countless generations. It is to realize that the past is not simply what happened, but what we remember, what we choose to carry forward, what we allow to shape our understanding of ourselves. The fire of Thermopylae still burns, not in the stones of the past or the ashes of the fallen, but in the stories we tell. Each time we recall Leonidas and his 300, each time we repeat the words, "Come and take them," we breathe life into that moment again. It is a story of courage, of sacrifice, of the defiance of freedom against power. It is a reminder that history is not made only by the vast and mighty, but sometimes by the small and the few, standing where the world seems ready to break, holding the line not for victory, but for meaning. Thermopylae teaches us that sometimes the most enduring victories are born of noble defeats. The memory of Thermopylae did not remain confined to scrolls of history or the whispers of oral tradition. It seeped into the fabric of culture itself, transforming from a single battle into a symbol that artists, poets, and philosophers return to again and again across centuries. Each retelling, each depiction, added a new layer to the legend, reshaping the meaning of Leonidas's stand according to the concerns of the age. In this way, Thermopylae became not only an event of antiquity, but a living story, woven into the imagination of civilization itself. In the world of ancient Greece, art was never far from history. The tragedians found in the Persian Wars a wellspring of material, weaving the drama of resistance into the fabric of the stage. Aeschylus, himself a veteran of Marathon, wrote The Persians, the earliest surviving Greek tragedy, which portrayed Xerxes' defeat through the lens of his own court. Though it did not recount Thermopylae directly, its spirit echoed with the same themes: hubris punished, freedom defended, empire humbled by the courage of the few. The audience, still scarred and proud from the wars, would have felt the resonance deeply. The theatre became a forum where memory and meaning intertwined, and in those shadows cast upon the stage, Thermopylae was never far away. Historians, too, shaped the legacy. Herodotus's account ensured that the details of the battle were preserved, though always with the narrative flourish of a man who sought not just to record events, but to explain them. His stories of laconic wit, of Leonidas's defiant words, of the men combing their hair before battle, these became touchstones of Western imagination. Later writers, from Plutarch to Diodorus, embellished and reinforced these themes, ensuring that the tale grew larger than life. What began as a desperate defense of a narrow pass became, in their words, a parable of civilization itself. Through their pens, Thermopylae passed from memory into legend. In art, the Spartans were immortalized in sculpture and painting, their forms rendered in marble and pigment as embodiments of discipline and courage. The fallen were often depicted not as broken men, but as serene, their sacrifice sanctified by composure in the face of death. Such imagery carried a message that resonated deeply in the ancient world, that true greatness lay not in survival, but in the nobility of one's end. This theme, so powerful in Spartan society, echoed across cultures that admired discipline and sacrifice. As the centuries passed, the story of Thermopylae traveled with the texts that preserved it. When the Renaissance dawned, Europe rediscovered the works of antiquity, and with them the tale of the hot gates. Painters of Italy and France took up the theme, capturing in oil and tempera the clash of bronze against endless hordes. Humanist scholars translated the words of Herodotus, making them accessible to new generations, hungry for the lessons of the past. To them, Thermopylae became a story not only of military valor, but of civic virtue, of free citizens standing against tyranny. In an age when kingdoms wrestled with the meaning of governance and liberty, Leonidas's defiance was transformed into an emblem of republican ideals. Poets found in Thermopylae inexhaustible inspiration. In the 18th and 19th centuries, when revolutions shook Europe and the Americas, the story was evoked again and again as a symbol of resistance. To those fighting against empire or monarchy, the Spartans represented the spirit of sacrifice demanded by freedom. Thermopylae was cited in speeches etched into pamphlets, carried on banners. Its meaning shifted, no longer tied to the peculiar laws of Sparta, but broadened into a universal call that liberty demands courage, and that courage often means standing against impossible odds. The epitaph of Simonides was recited in new tongues, its words adapted to modern struggles, reminding all who heard them that to die in obedience to a higher law is to live forever in memory. The 19th century saw Thermopylae painted onto vast canvases, its heroes depicted with chiseled features and noble bearing, their enemies darkened into anonymous multitudes. Romanticism embraced the story with fervor, finding in it the sublime, human will confronting inexorable fate, beauty born of tragedy. Painters like Jacques-Louis David and sculptors across Europe used the imagery of Leonidas and his men to stir emotions of patriotism and sacrifice. Nationalist movements found in the Spartans a convenient archetype. a small nation holding against larger empires, the few standing for the many. Thermopylae became a political symbol as much as an artistic one, invoked wherever people sought to assert their right to self-determination. Even in modernity, Thermopylae has not lost its allure. The 20th century, scarred by wars of unprecedented scale, often returned to the story as both inspiration and warning. During World War II, when Nazi forces swept through Greece, Allied soldiers drew strength from the legacy of the Spartans. At Thermopylae itself, Australian and New Zealand troops made a stand in 1941, invoking the spirit of Leonidas as they resisted overwhelming German forces. Though they too were forced to retreat, the echo of history gave their struggle meaning beyond the immediate tactical outcome. Thermopylae reminded them that even in defeat, there can be honor, and that sacrifice for freedom resonates far beyond the battlefield. Literature and cinema of the modern age have continued to reinterpret the legend. Poets such as Byron and Tennyson invoked Thermopylae in their verses, finding in it a shorthand for noble resistance. In recent decades, popular culture has brought the story to global audiences in new forms, through novels, graphic art, and film. These retellings often take liberties, exaggerating or simplifying, but the core remains unchanged, the few standing against the many, courage in the face of annihilation. The persistence of Thermopylae in cultural imagination speaks to the universal human need for such stories, for reminders that bravery can transform defeat into something eternal. And yet, the modern retellings also reveal the complexities of myth. In celebrating the Spartans, we risk romanticizing a society that was in many ways harsh, exclusionary, and rigid. Their heroism is undeniable, but their world was not our own, and to transplant their ideals uncritically is to misunderstand them. Thermopylae challenges us to see both sides of the coin, the beauty of sacrifice and the danger of blind obedience, the nobility of defiance and the costs of militarism. The legend is powerful precisely because it is not simple, because it invites reflection as much as admiration. Philosophers too have grappled with Thermopylae. The story raises timeless questions about duty, freedom, and the meaning of death. Is it better to die for a cause than to live without it? Does courage lie in fighting when victory is possible, or when defeat is certain? The Spartans force us to confront these dilemmas, to ask ourselves what we value enough to risk everything for. Their example does not provide easy answers, but it illuminates the questions in ways that remain hauntingly relevant. In classrooms and academies, Thermopylae is still studied not only as military history, but as philosophy in action, a test case of human values under the harshest conditions. Through art, literature, philosophy, and politics, Thermopylae has endured as more than an ancient battle. It has become a story that each age reshapes to its own purposes, a mirror reflecting our struggles, our ideals, our fears. The past itself is quiet now, the clash of armies long gone, but the story lives on in canvases, in pages, in the words of leaders and the dreams of peoples. It is proof that history is not confined to what happened, but to what is remembered, to what continues to inspire and provoke thought across centuries. Thermopylae is not just a place on a map or a date in a chronicle. It is a living legend, a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming power, human courage can leave a mark that time cannot erase. The tale of Thermopylae does not end with the dust of battle settling in 480 BCE, nor with the victories at Salamis and Plataea that followed. It endures precisely because it exists in the tension between myth and reality, between what happened and what we choose to believe happened, between the brutal truth of warfare and the idealized image of noble sacrifice. To reflect on Thermopylae is to confront that paradox and to ask why this particular story, among so many from history, has clung to human memory so tenaciously. The answer lies not only in the drama of the event itself, but in the way it embodies universal questions about power, freedom, mortality, and meaning. Reality, stripped of embellishment, tells us that 300 Spartans, supported by allies from other Greek cities, held a narrow mountain pass for 3 days before being overwhelmed. They fought bravely, but they lost. They did not save Greece by their actions alone, though their resistance did buy precious time. They were not superhuman, though their training and discipline were formidable. They lived within a society that demanded total obedience, one that enslaved others to maintain its way of life. These truths remind us that history is messy, that heroism often coexists with harshness, that noble deeds can spring from imperfect worlds. The Spartans of Thermopylae were both human and symbolic, flawed and extraordinary. Myth, however, works differently. In myth, the Spartans become eternal guardians of freedom, men who stood against tyranny with nothing but their courage and their spears. In myth, they are remembered not for losing, but for refusing to yield, for turning defeat into a triumph of spirit. This transformation of history into legend has given Thermopylae its enduring power. Myths need not be literal to be true. They speak in the language of meaning rather than fact. Thermopylae's myth has become a canvas upon which generations project their own struggles, a reminder that values worth dying for exist even when victory is impossible. The coexistence of reality and myth is what makes Thermopylae such a compelling story. The historian seeks accuracy, peeling back the layers of exaggeration. The poet seeks resonance, amplifying the themes that stir the heart. Between them lies the enduring legacy, a balance of truth and inspiration. Perhaps this is why Thermopylae has been invoked across so many ages. It is flexible, adaptable, able to serve as both a lesson in tactics and a parable of sacrifice. It is as much philosophy as it is history, as much imagination as it is memory. For humanity, Thermopylae raises a question that each generation must answer anew. What does it mean to resist overwhelming force? Is resistance worthwhile when the outcome seems certain? For some, the answer lies in pragmatism, survival at any cost, negotiation over annihilation. For others, the answer lies in principle, better to fall with honor than to live in submission. The Spartans chose the latter, and their choice has echoed through time. Their stand reminds us that the meaning of life is not measured solely in survival, but in what we are willing to endure, what we are willing to risk, and what we are willing to lose in order to remain true to ourselves. This lesson resonates in the modern world, where the forms of conflict have changed but the dilemmas remain. Nations still face questions of how to confront greater powers. Individuals still wrestle with when to compromise and when to hold firm. In moments of crisis, Thermopylae becomes more than an ancient tale. It becomes a mirror in which we see our own struggles reflected. The story asks us, if the odds were against you, if defeat was certain, would you still stand, and if so, why? Thermopylae also forces us to consider the cost of heroism. Leonidas and his men did not survive. Their families mourned them, their city lost its king, their lives ended in violence. Heroism in the real world comes at a terrible price. It is not glamorous, it is not bloodless. To romanticize it too much is to forget the human cost, the pain, the loss. Yet to ignore it is to forget that courage has always been part of the human story, that some choose to risk everything for the sake of others. The balance between honoring sacrifice and acknowledging its burden is delicate but essential. Thermopylae teaches us to hold both truths together, the beauty of courage and the tragedy of loss. Why does this story continue to matter? Because it touches something timeless in the human condition. We all face forces larger than ourselves, whether they be armies, empires, or the relentless march of time. We all stand at our own Thermopylae, in moments where we must decide whether to yield or resist, whether to compromise or hold firm, whether to live at any cost or to risk everything for something greater. Most of us will not face such choices on a battlefield, but the metaphor extends beyond war. It lives in struggles for justice, in battles against oppression, in the quiet defiance of those who refuse to bow before cruelty. Thermopylae matters because it reminds us that resistance has meaning, even when victory seems impossible. And so the story continues to inspire, not because it is simple, but because it is complex. It is at once a tale of defeat and triumph, of flawed men and timeless values, of harsh realities and soaring ideals. It teaches us that myths are not lies, but vessels of truth, carrying the essence of what we most cherish about humanity. The 300 Spartans may have fallen, but in their fall they rose into legend, and in legend they endure. If you stand today at the hot gates, the sea now further from the past than it once was, the mountains rising silent around you, you can almost feel the weight of that history. The stones are quiet, the wind gentle, the world far removed from the clash of bronze and the cries of battle. Yet something lingers, the ground remembers. The spirit of resistance, the defiance of the few against the many, the refusal to yield even in the face of annihilation. It is there, in the silence, in the imagination, in the story we continue to tell. To stand at Thermopylae is to understand that history is not dead, that the past is not gone, that the choices of long ago still speak to us now. For ultimately, Thermopylae is not about Greece or Persia alone. It is about humanity. It is about the eternal tension between freedom and power, between courage and fear, between mortality and meaning. It is about the recognition that though we are small, though we are finite, we can choose how we stand, how we fight, how we live, and how we die. In that choice lies our dignity, our legacy, our place in the great story of time. Thermopylae teaches us that though we cannot control the outcome, we can control the manner of our stand, and in that lies immortality. And so the story endures, carried across centuries, retold in countless forms, reshaped by each generation but never lost. Thermopylae is more than a battle. It is a beacon. It is the fire that reminds us of what courage can mean, what sacrifice can achieve, what freedom demands. The 300 stood, and in their stand, they defied not only an empire, but time itself. Their bodies fell, but their story lives, whispered across ages, carried in the hearts of all who believe that even the smallest group, even the most hopeless cause, can shape the destiny of the world.